Our next speaker is Barbara Jones. Barbara is an ecologist who's worked for conservation bodies in Scotland and Wales, specialising in the conservation of upland plants and habitats. And she's going to talk about her work today, focusing on Wales. Barbara.
Thank you, John. Conserving upland plants, can we give them a future? A lot of conservation of upland plants is done by general habitat conservation, whereby most widespread plants are protected by management measures such as reducing grazing or peatland restoration. And this is really important. But there are some populations of scarce and rare plants that need some more focused intervention. And I'm going to talk about some of the work done on some of those species today. But first of all, I'd like to share with you a couple of comments I often get when I'm talking about conserving upland plants. And the first one of these is people saying, well, why bother? I mean, the plants are in the uplands, there's no problem. They're not being dug up, they're not being built on, they're fine up there. You know, why don't you spend your time and effort working on something else? Well, I think I shouldn't need to tell you as members of the BSBI that that is somewhat false. There are many pressures on the uplands and on upland plants. And one of the main things being our friends, the sheep here. Sheep grazing in the UK uplands has been pervasive for many, many years, leading to lots of sites like this where you get lots of bare hillsides just covered by grazing resistant grasses, where most self-respecting plants have retreated to cliffs and more inaccessible areas that the sheep can't get to. And you end up with very small populations of these species because they can only grow in certain places. Peatlands as well, grazing will open up the sward there, and then that together with people walking and trampling on their land will open up the peat to the wind and the rain, and then that gets worn away, and before you know it, you're right down to the bare earth, and all the peat with its wonderful array of plants is gone. Similarly with our woodlands, we've got some superb woodlands fringing the uplands in the UK, with all the bryophytes and ferns and lichens that they hold. But some of them haven't been very well managed. There's no young trees growing up underneath. So give a woodland like this, I don't know, 50 years or so, and there'll be nothing left. So I hope we can all agree that there are many pressures on upland plants, and we do need to do something to protect them. Another comment I often get is that why conserve them in Britain when there are much better populations abroad? We tend to have just edge of range species, I suppose. And if you go to the bigger mountain and Arctic areas of the world, then you'll get far bigger populations. So surely we should be concentrating in Britain on plants that are important in a global context. Well, there is something to that argument, but I think I'd like to counter it with a few arguments of my own. First one is that a lot of the plants that we find here, these upland alpine plants, are right on the edge of the range, and they're often in atypical habitats. And that means they're often quite slightly different phenotypically and genetically from those in the centre of the range. And that's really important in long-term in speciation and evolution to new forms and new species. We lose those and we lose that evolutionary potential. They're also susceptible to environmental changes, so they're good indicators of change. It's like the canary in the cage, I suppose. It's something that will give you a sign that something's not quite right, and that's an early indicator. Reduction in change of species, in ranges of species, also means reduced diversity generally. Death by 1,000 cuts. I mean, we've heard this so many times. You lose a little bit here, a little bit there, and before you know it, you're just down to the core populations. And then does something start nibbling at the edges of those? You have to draw the line somewhere. And diversity is important locally as well as globally. And I think it's so important that people can experience diversity locally as well as globally. Wouldn't it be a sad world if we couldn't see, say, the Snowdon lily or purple saxifraga in Wales or in the UK? We had to go abroad to see it. So I think it's really important that people can see things in their own country, in their own areas. So there are my two reasons for conserving upland alpine plants in Britain. So let's have a look at a few examples of what's been done in the past few years. Well, this Gagea serotina is one very close to my heart. I've spent many years researching this plant. Now, this is one that isn't rare in a global context. It's found in the Alps, the Himalaya, the Rocky Mountains, and it's really quite abundant there. It's only here in the UK that it's pretty rare. Only a few small populations in Wales. It's right at the edge of its range again, and it's been isolated for a long, long time. Now, until a few years ago, the conservation organisations in Wales were tasked with conserving this plant, but we knew hardly anything about it. Was it increasing? Was it decreasing? How was it doing? Was it producing seed? Was that seed viable? Did we need to bring something in from abroad to try and rescue it? We knew very little about it. And what we really needed to know is the population dynamics, and do the Welsh populations have any genetic variation? So in other words, to compare it with populations at the core, so we could see how the Welsh populations were doing. Now, when you're studying upland plants in Britain, you have to be prepared to chuck a rope over the edge and get stuck in, because most of them grow in pretty inaccessible places. You can get to a few down at the bottom by scrambling around, but certainly with Gagea serotina, it does like its steep areas. Now, there are two main cliffs that I've been looking at over the past few years, and this is one of them up on the Gagea. And what I've done at these two cliffs is I've marked a series of sub-sites. You might be able to see a little metal tag there. And on this cliff, on the Gagea, there's 20 small sub-sites. And each of these, every time I go up, I'm counting the number of plants, the number that are flowering, and the number that are setting seed to get an idea of the population dynamics. Now, that's fine. That would tell us what's happening in Wales, but really we need to compare that with what's happening in the wider context in its core areas. So the main place that I've done my research abroad is in the Rocky Mountains, and this is a place called Niwot Ridge, and it's in Colorado. And this is a long-term ecological research site run by the University of Colorado. And this is their tundra lab, where you can do experiments out in the field. And more importantly, you can also shelter when they have their afternoon thunderstorms. Now, working on something like Gagea serotina here is a doddle. You just walk around. You don't need ropes. You don't need to hang around. It's not cold and miserable as it can be on the Welsh cliffs. It's very easy, and there is a lot of it. I think they found it quite amusing when this woman from Wales came over there and was trying not to stand on these plants. But honestly, they grow like daisies over there. There are so many of them. So the idea of going out there was to get some idea of the population dynamics of this species in the centre of its range. Now, if we look at this, the figures in black are the two Welsh sites that I've been looking at, one on the Gagea and one on Snowdon, and the red figures are from Niwot Ridge. Now here, if we look at flowers as a percentage of plants, the two sites in Wales, pretty low. I mean, it's 10% the highest flowering. That's quite low. And when you compare it with what's happening in America, they're much higher. But I mean, we are talking about a plant that's on the edge of its range and in a slightly less than ideal habitat, but it is flowering. If we look at capsules as a percentage of plants, you can see we're getting a bit closer. It's very low in Wales, very low, but it's not incredibly high in the ones in the centre of its range in Niwot Ridge. And as for capsules as a percentage of flowers, well, we're getting much more closer together. You get some quite high figures here for the Welsh populations, and similar to what's happening in America. Now, this is giving, I suppose, what you'd expect, that a plant on the edge of its range, it's struggling a bit. It's not producing great numbers of flowers, but it is producing flowers. It is producing seed. And what the most important thing from that is that the seed is viable, because it had been written that the Welsh plants, well, they might produce a bit of seed, but it's not viable. It's not growing, so it's not reproducing sexually, but it is, and this seed is viable. So looking at the long-term monitoring of Gagea in Wales, this is, the top one is the Snowdon site and the bottom one is the Gagea site. And you can see that the numbers of flowers and capsules is very low all the way along. But if you look at the numbers of plants, this is from 1994 to 2019, at the Clogwyn site, they're fluctuating, but it's generally going down a little bit. But if you look at the Gagea site, then the numbers have gone really quite low. They've more than halved in the time I've been looking at them since 1992. Now, this is a bit worrying, but part of me says that, well, they've been there since for about 10,000 years, and so hopefully they can hang on a bit longer. But the other part of this is that a lot of this loss is from one particular subsite, which did have well over 200 or so plants on it, mainly vegetative ones, not flowering. And that's completely died out now. And I'm just wondering whether it gets into a particular subsite, colonizes it, grows, perhaps uses up the resources there, dies off, and then another subsite is hopefully colonized as well. This is something I'd have to look at in the longer term, but it's certainly worth keeping an eye on these, because it is going down, down, down. I'm due to go up again next year to have a look, so hopefully we might get a little bit of an uptick there. So that's looking at what's happening at the present, but we also need to look at the future of this species as well as many others. And a lot of people will say to me, well, why do you bother looking at the genetics? You know, can't you just look at the plant and what it's doing and etc. But genetic conservation is so important because genetic diversity is fundamental to biological diversity, and it governs the ability of plants to persist on an evolutionary timescale, a long timescale. And what's important for us is that small fragmented populations, which sums up the case in a lot of the species that we're talking about now, they're most at risk from the harmful effects of low genetic diversity because of genetic drift. So you get things like inbreeding depression, low survival rates, poor adaptation, etc. So we need to know what's happening in the genetics of these species so we can see what's going to happen into the future. So genetic variation in Gagea. Do the small populations have any in Wales? And how does that compare to populations in the core? So you collect lots of material, you bash hell out of it, you apply a few chemicals, and then you apply an electric current and see what happens. And this is what happens. This is a pretty complex graph, but all I want you to look at here is the column on the left, which is the name of the sites that I've been looking at. All these top ones are from North America. Clyd and Clogwyn are the two Welsh ones, and these three at the bottom are three from the Alps, the European Alps. And then just look at this third column, which is has A at the top. And basically, this is a measure of the amount of diversity you'll get in the genes in these particular populations. One means no diversity. So this population here that's just got one from Apache, this is from New Mexico, has basically got no diversity, and it's probably on a hiding to nothing. It's probably going to die out in the next few years. The highest is at Niwot Ridge, the place I showed you about. This is 1.8 here, and that's pretty high. But you'd expect that from a population that's very big, that's got lots of sexual reproduction going on there and lots of diversity. But if you come down here and look at our two Welsh ones, they're 1.2, which isn't particularly high, but it's the same as these three in the Alps, which are big populations and well connected. And it's higher than these three here, which are in Canada, which are also fairly big populations. So immediately we can say, well, the two populations in Wales, they do have some diversity genetically. It's not particularly high, but they do have some. So we don't need to rush in there straight away to start rescuing them genetically. Another thing that the genetic studies shows us is how related these different populations are. Now, I'm sure you've all seen these tree diagrams before. Basically, the higher the linkage up here, the further away these populations are genetically from each other. Now, all of these on the right are from North America, all of these on the left are the European. You'd expect them to be not very related at all because they've got the whole of the Atlantic Ocean between them and many, many years as well. So if we look just on the left, you've got the three alpine populations here and the two Welsh ones, and they're very highly separated as well, more so than you would expect, considering that these two Welsh ones probably came from the alpine ones. But I'm thinking there that possibly the Welsh ones survived at least the last glacial advance, if not the last one or two, on ice refuges or nunataks. And that would have enabled them to diverge genetically for much longer than these alpine ones. And lastly, the two Welsh ones themselves are really quite widely separated, considering that they're only about 5 miles apart. They're quite different. And the idea here again is that they might only be less than 5 miles apart, but there's not going to be many flies or insects that fly from one side to the other, cross-pollinating them. So these as well have diverged somewhat. This is not to say that they're different species or subspecies or anything like that. It's all very much the same species, but they do have their differences. So what does all this mean for conservation of Gagea? Well, basically, I'd say that it means that they have some diversity genetically. They are slightly different. They don't need immediate rescue. So what we really need to do is just increase the populations, give them the possibility of spreading off their inaccessible cliffs and onto the steep rocky ground below, so that they've got more chance of sexual reproduction, more chance of building up that diversity to cope with whatever's going to throw at them at the future in terms of environmental change. It might seem a lot of work to come up with a solution that, you know, get the population bigger, but we could have found something very different, which meant that we'd have to go in and do some rescue work. So let's move on from that to look at something different. I've got some taxonomic questions here. We often talk about, is it a separate species? Is it a subspecies, a hybrid? Is it native? And these might seem academic questions to some, but they're very important when you have only restricted resources, limited resources for conservation. So taxonomic questions can be relevant, very relevant. Where do you focus your resources? And usually we like to go for native plant subspecies, etc. Now, one example relating to this, it's not particularly an upland one, but it does relate to a number of issues that relate to upland plants. And this is Juniperus communis subspecies hemispherica. And it's thought that the subspecies hemispherica is present in Cornwall and in South Wales. And in recent years, we've wondered whether it was also present in North Wales. Now, on Holyhead Mountain, right on the tip of Anglesey, there are 3 small bushes of this possible subspecies hemispherica, 2 of them in this gully, and 1 of them on Holyhead Mountain itself, just 3 bushes left on the whole area. And we were wondering whether this was a subspecies hemispherica as well. And if that is the case, then we needed to do some emergency conservation work to try and protect this species and increase the numbers. So the idea was to do a study looking at the material from Cornwall, from South Wales and from North Wales, and to compare it with what's happening in the wider sense with Juniperus communis, subspecies communis. So we go out and collect, back to the usual thing. Sometimes you don't come down, sometimes you go up a cliff, other times you have to go down it. This is collecting on Ramsay Island, and I'm not asking you to recognise this person. This is Sam Bosanquet, who I'm sure a lot of you do know, collecting material from Ramsay Island. So what we did is we sent all this material up to Botanic Garden in Edinburgh, and they looked at some microsatellite loci and produced this coordinate plot, which shows similarities or differences between different populations. Now, if you look, the blue dots here are subspecies communis. This was our comparison, and we collected these from all over the UK. And here they are, taking up this central area of the graph. Now, there are 3 possible subspecies hemispherica. First one was from Cornwall with the solid red squares. And you can see that they're grouped here in a separate grouping, which shows that there's probably something going on here, and they could well be a separate subspecies. But the 2 possibilities from South Wales and North Wales just mingle in here with the subspecies communis, and you can see them scattered around, which suggests very strongly that they're not a subspecies, but they're just a slightly different form. We all know that juniper does have very different forms, and it could be that these growing right by the sea are just developing differently morphologically. So does that mean the pressure's taken off and we don't have to go in and do a rescue of these? Or possibly, but the idea was that juniper's not doing very well anyway, and we do need to increase the populations. So we made the decision to collect material from North Wales and from Ramsay, take cuttings, and they were propagated by a local nursery and grown on, and then we planted these out on site. Now on Holyhead, we planted about 70 or so of these out, and you can see one up in the top here, tiny little cutting. Some they're monitored quite often, And some of them are doing very well, some obviously not so much so, but we'll be continuing monitoring those for the next few years. I'm not quite sure what's happening with Ramsey at the moment. I do know that material has been taken down there, but if anyone here is involved in that, perhaps they could drop a line on the chat thing and we could see what's happening down there. So back up to the mountains. This is looking at Saxifraga cespitosa. Now, some of you may remember I took some of you up to Comidwell a few years ago, and we all went to look at this species. Again, it's one of these that's not rare at all on a world scale, but in Britain it is. There's just a few of them in Scotland, and just one site down south of the border in Comidwell. And this is one of the most southerly European sites. Now, in the mid-70s, it had declined to about 4 plants, mainly due to plas collecting, but also grazing, of course. And a restocking programme was started at that time, it's about 1976, to aim for a self-sustaining population. So seed was collected, plants grown on at Nest Botanic Gardens, and then material was planted out. I think it's about over 400 seedlings and mature plants were introduced. Now, looking at the graph of what's happened since then, this work was done by David Parker, who has produced this graph, and some of you may well know him. This is looking from 1978 onwards, and these are the total plants. And you can see the first few years goes right down, which quite often happens with the introduction programs. And then it kind of toddles on and on and on, but it's pretty low all the way around. Now, I went up there a couple of weeks ago and had a look at the introduced site, and I could only see 1 or 2. I know David would find more, but the numbers are really very, very low. But if you look at these other 2 colours here, the red are the restocked sites, numbers, yes, they're going down, 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 down. Native sites, these are the sites where the seed was collected from originally, and nothing else was planted there, they were just left. And it's very interesting that for about 15 years, nothing happened. And then suddenly at one of the sites, it just started growing again, showing that the seed is viable for at least that long. And they've been doing relatively well, but they're only on 2 boulders, 2 tiny little lumps. And all it needs is someone to sit on there or a sheep to come and graze the lowest bit, and we'd lose those. So we have to decide now, should we intervene again? Why is it still declining? Is it climate change? Is the habitat not suitable anymore? Is it just because they're very small populations, or is it sheep and goat grazing? How long will the seed bank last? There's a lot of things that we have to think about before we think of perhaps doing some reintroductions, restocking. And there are so many things you have to think about with restocking. But I do sometimes wonder in Wales whether we're a little bit conservative with that. And I'll illustrate that by showing you what's happening in the Lake District. On Helvellyn, which is a very botanically rich site, they've recently started planting out a number of different species. And this is someone planting out woolly willow, which had declined to 23 small bushes on the mountain, and they were all females. So that was on a hiding to nothing. So they've collected material from Galloway over the border in Scotland and planted it out. And now they have about 1,000 bushes of mixed sex, and they're hoping that in the future that they will develop into a self-sustaining population. They're also doing that with Dryas octopetala, mountain avens, and they're bringing material there from Fort William area up in Scotland. Now, that might be very important because they could lose Dryas, especially if they don't do anything. But how happy are we with that kind of thing to happen? Because a lot of people have judgments about the genetic distinctiveness of plants or populations. And if we start moving things throughout the country, are we going to obscure geographical patterns? And I know a lot of conservation is gardening, but how far does gardening go? Is this really gardening? I mean, we're planting these, we're moving them all around the country, we go up and water them, we check on them. Do we have to draw a line somewhere, or do we say, okay, well, if we don't do something, these plants will die out? These are very important questions. And I think a lot of the species I'm talking about, we're going to have to make decisions on these in the next few years. Woodsia ilvensis, oblong Woodsia, is one of these. It's another of these endangered in the UK, but not globally. Right on the edge of its range, it's been over-collected. There are about 100 plants, or perhaps a few more than that in the whole of the UK. And in Wales, we've just got 12 of them, 12 small plants. So what are we doing for it? Well, there are ex situ collections, obviously. We have to have that as our insurance policy. We control grazing access. Is that going to make a difference? Are they being grazed? We continue monitoring, obviously, and considering what's causing the decline. But in Scotland and England, again, they've done some reintroductions and restocking. But in Wales, again, in our usual rather conservative way, we said, no, we don't need to do the restocking. We need to do some more surveying. And one reason for that is, again, I took a few people up to see it on Wild Hebog some years ago. And if you remember, just next to the cave, there's a line of plants right close to the ground at the bottom of a cliff. Now, I went up there once, I looked up and I thought, this is ridiculous. I mean, there's 3 or 4 plants at the bottom here. There's got to be more up on the cliff. So we threw a rope over, did a few upsells and found 3 more plants, which doesn't sound very much. But when you only had 9 plants anyway, then 3 is a fairly big increase in percentage. So I'm pretty sure there are probably more up there. We need to do some more survey, but we also need to start thinking, do we need to do some reintroductions as well? Climate change. Now, at the beginning of this talk, I was saying that some of the threats on the plants in the uplands are mainly from grazing and land management, and that is definitely still the case. But climate change is slightly kicking in, and it's going to kick in more in the future. So what can we do about that? Apart from countries, reducing their input of carbon dioxide, etc. Well, all we can do at the moment is to do some monitoring. We've set up a long-term monitoring system to look at a series of 6 species you can see here listed. And there's species that aren't very rare, but they will likely to be affected by climate change in the future. And what we've done is set up a series of locations, about 40 of them on Snowdon. Not that you need a rope to access, because that makes things so much more difficult, but just a slight distance up so that they're not going to be grazed. And every few years we go up and place the quadrat in an exact position that's been marked. And each of these quadrats is divided into 100 sections. And what we do is at each place, look at the specific plant that we're looking at there. And here it's purple saxifrage, and see how many of these subdivisions has been is occupied by the species. And in the long term, the hope is to see whether it's expanding, whether it's reducing, or whether it's been outcompeted by grasses and so on. It's going to be a very long-term thing because nothing will happen very quickly. So I'm looking forward to going up in my Zimmer frame in about 50 years' time and seeing what's happening. So let's look at the future and environmental change. So far, a lot of the work we've been doing it involves looking at the genetics of plants, but basically just looking at what the diversity is there. But there have been recent advances in genetics and genomics, looking at how plants respond to environmental challenges and what favours adaptation and spread. So basically what they're trying to do now is to look right down into the genetics of the plant and look at the genes and see which genes are responsible for, say, coping with high temperature or coping with rainfall. So it's no longer good enough to say, well, this plant won't grow here because it's too cold or it's too hot or whatever. They're trying to drill down to find out exactly what's causing this. So it's looking at the genotype and seeing how that results in what the actual plant is.
Sorry to interrupt, Barbara. You've got about 2 minutes.
Oh, it might be a bit longer than that, but not much longer. So does the genetic diversity of a species confer fitness? Just measuring them out doesn't tell you how fit a species is in its environment, because some may be very well adapted. But now what they're trying to do is say, where are the adaptive genes? How do they control adaptation in a population? So this is getting really quite technical now. But meanwhile, site-based conservation continues. Lots of alpines. This is commiddle. I'm sure you all know it. Grazing removed there a few years ago to try and increase the spread and size of these populations, which are pretty restricted at the back. So things happen slowly, but already we've got Saxifraga hypnoides spreading on the back of the comb. Trollius is starting to move a little bit as well. If you go there in July, you see the Northesium, the bog asphodel. If you go up there now, it'll look like a buttercup meadow. It's superb. And it's also looking very shaggy up there. It's looking far more natural. Last thing to look at is just media interest. It might seem a little bit silly, but we do quite often have the media wanting to come up and see, especially Snowdon lily. I'll try and get them on other plants, but they do like that. Michael Portillo was up a few years ago with his railway journeys. We've had Alan Titchmarsh up here, and they're quite good to get a message out to the general public who don't generally know about the issues to do with uplands. So I do, whenever this happens, I do try and get a message up there. This is going to be my last slide, so I won't be long now. So what's the way ahead for all this? Well, I think it can be summed up by looking at Cerastium alpinum here, which is, again, not restricted on a worldwide sense. But in Wales, there are just two tiny little populations high up in the Glyder, and they're literally just square inches each. There's two tiny little patches of it. Whenever I look at them or think of them, I think of a saying I saw in a book some years ago, which says we need evolutionary potential. So conserving small, isolated, threatened populations is more like preservation than conservation. And I think that's right. If you think of those two tiny little groups, we're just preserving them. They've not got any evolutionary potential. They're not going to do anything much at all, apart from probably die off in the near future. So there are 4 ways ahead I can see that we can conserve these plants in the future. We can be pragmatic and we can look at them and say, okay, well, we tried our best. Climate change is coming. You know, there's nothing else we can do. Let's just let them die out. They're not threatened globally, so we'll let them die out. Or we could be traditional. We could collect seed, as we've done in the past, grow it on, plant it out again, reduce the grazing a little bit and cross our fingers and hope that it works. Or we could perhaps be a bit more adaptive. We could look at what the possible environment for this plant species is in the next 50 years, say, and then we could collect material from plants that are already growing in that environment, perhaps in the Alps or wherever, and plant that out. So at least it would have a bit of a flying start to cope with future conditions. Or lastly, we could be a bit more futuristic. Now, I've been talking earlier about the advances in genetics. And they will get to such an extent that we could go in there and do some genetic manipulation. We could find out which are the genes that code for resistance to high temperatures or low rainfall or whatever. And we could tweak them so that the plant could cope with these conditions in the future. We already do it with food crops. So why not do it with these plants? At least we'd then still be able to have them on the hills. They'd look exactly the same as they do, and not many people would know what had happened. But we would know, and would we be happy with something like that? There are some very strong feelings regarding GMOs. So I think there could be very strong feelings with that. But it may be that is what we have to do to protect some of these plants into the future. Otherwise, we could well lose them. Whichever way we go in these approaches, I think it's going to be an interesting future. Thank you.
Thanks, Barbara, for a fascinating talk. From Jim, would Snowdon lily survive on the grassy ledges below cliffs, or would it get grazed?
It would definitely get grazed. If it's accessible to sheep and goats as well in the Cymydwell area, then it would get grazed. I have seen it growing below the cliffs or on slightly more accessible areas, and got quite excited about, you know, some double flowering plants only to see them grazed the next time I go up there. So we're not expecting any of these plants to grow widely on the grazed grassland. They will grow on the cliffs, but what we want to do is bring them off the cliffs onto the more accessible rocky areas. And also the grassland areas, they'll be too wet and there'll be too much competition for them.
Thank you. And now a question from Wendy Moore. With the probability of more frequent upland fires with climate change, what approach could be adopted for preservation, conservation, or complete rethink?
Yeah, this is a difficult one. I have quite a few people saying, well, we shouldn't be rewilding, we shouldn't be having more heath there, we shouldn't be having more trees because they're just going to get burnt. But that's not always the case. First of all, a lot of the plants I've been talking about don't grow in that kind of heathery area where they're likely to get burnt. They're up on the cliffs, on the grass, on the rocky areas, so they're unlikely to be affected. The west of Britain is wetter, so we're less likely to have big fires. But having said that, I do know that they can occur. But what I really think is that we should not stop conserving and rewilding and encouraging more heath and woodland just because we may get fires. I think what we need to do is bring in plans for management for if and when fires do happen. Management such as fire breaks, having less drainage, so you're keeping the land being wetter, fire management plans for each area, fire beaters and so on. And also there's a lot of education needed. I get very angry when I see all these shops showing disposable barbecues and people are just going out and using them with no advice on how to use them, how to dispose of them, how to be careful not to cause fires. So I think we need a lot of education as well. So I really do think we don't need a complete rethink. We need to continue doing what we're doing, but we do need better management in case of fires and much better education to try and prevent them in the first place.
Thank you. And then a question from Peter Fowkes. Can you account for differences in the numbers of Gagea plants on clogwyn and glider populations?
Hello, Peter. The main difference is that the plants on the glider site, well, the glider site itself is bigger. It's a bigger site than the clogwyn site, much bigger. And it's also better habitat for them because there's less competition. It's more of a steep cliff so that they can grow in the cracks and underneath the overhangs. Whereas the clogwyn site on Snowdon is more of an open rib and you do get competition from other species, but it is a smaller site. So basically it's size as much as anything.
Yeah. We had, we had an anonymous question in and it says, are there historical records of other populations in Wales? I don't know if that was Gagea or...
I presume so. Well,
yeah.
Well, if it is Gagea, then it's very difficult to sort out the old records because a lot of them are very hazy, as I'm sure everyone knows. You get a record that there's a plant seen on Snowdon or there's a plant seen on the glider or whatever. Well, where is it? But from what we can see, that there don't seem to be any different sites than the 6 main ones that we know at the moment. But what it does seem is that when some of the earliest records were taken, they were much more accessible because I've seen examples of Victorians and pre-Victorians collecting Lloydia very easily. You know, they can easily go in and collect a bunch of it and have it on their table when they're having dinner in the Penagurd in the evening. And you think, oh, no, for God's sake, collecting whole bunches of this thing. That's why we've not got a lot left. So I think it was a lot more accessible in the past. But I think possibly mainly the main sites, there could have been more of it scattered around, but I think from when we're talking about records, there's probably much less.
Yeah. And also on Gagea, I think a question from Richard Birch. If the population declined in diversity, how would you rescue them genetically? I mean, it might apply to other plants as well.
Yeah, well, if they did decline that much at one particular site, perhaps, then yes, perhaps if they declined a lot at the Snowdon site, it would be useful to bring in material from the glider site because they would be the nearest in terms of adaptation and the nearest genetically. So you could do that as the initial thing. And if that didn't work, then perhaps from alpine populations. But as I showed in that graph, they are fairly different, the ones in the Alps. But if you're likely to lose them anyway, then, you know, you'd have to experiment. But you could do the experimentation in the garden first, you know, to do some crossing and see how they grow. The most difficult thing with that, though, is that it's a hell of a difficult plant to grow in cultivation. I've killed more Lloydia than I dare to admit in a public forum. But I've given Lloydia, sorry, not Lloydia, see, I've spent so long studying it as Lloydia. I've given Gagea material to the Botanic Garden at Kew, at Edinburgh, or to many places, and they've all killed it as well. The only one place that can keep it alive is Aberconwy Nursery, just south of Llandudno, and they've managed to keep it alive for much longer than anyone else. So if we did do any experimentation in the garden, then it could be quite difficult. But, you know, if we got someone skilled at it, then fine. But yes, I would first of all bring in material from close by, and then if that didn't work, from further away as well.
And one from me on Gagea, you were talking about subsites, and as far as I can remember, where some subsites Gagea might decline after being fairly widespread. I just wondered if you were seeing it at new subsites at all. You're identifying new subsites.
Yeah, but again, that's a difficult one because it's a fairly big cliff, the one that I'm doing this on the glider. And I've chosen, say, about a third of that cliff and I do 3 abseils down there, and I've got these specific sites. I try and look at separate ones in between times, but it may be that you just see a couple of leaves coming out one year and then you don't see them the next, or perhaps there's 4 leaves the next year. What I'm trying to keep an eye on is anything that looks like it might be developing into a new one. But to do that completely, I'd have to cover the whole site and survey the whole site every year, and that could be quite difficult. But it's something I'm very aware of and something I'm trying to keep an eye on. Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Barbara.